All right, so we're going to do a deep dive today on a topic that maybe isn't the most exciting, but we're going to try to make it interesting for you. It's the IRS. And, you send in a bunch of sources, and some of them were practical tax tips. And some of them were, bigger questions about the future of the IRS. But one of the things that really jumped out at me was, is it true that some people might be getting surprise payments from the IRS?
Yeah, you've been doing your research. There's a lot in here.
And then what's the deal with all this talk about, like, dismantling the IRS or sending agents to the border?
Yeah, I think it's a really fascinating mix of sources here, and we can definitely connect the dots. And maybe we could start with those practical tips that you found and then see how they relate to those bigger picture ideas about the IRS and its future.
Sounds good. So, I found this YouTube video
Yeah.
from this guy called the Flipping Accountant, and he's giving some advice. And, it seems like filing even earlier than that January 27th start date could really benefit you. Have you ever heard of the IRS free file program?
Oh, yeah. Free file is a great option if you're trying to get your refund faster. It's available for people with an adjusted gross income of $84,000 or less. So that might apply to you if you're listening.
And then there was another video. This one was from CBS New York.
Hmm.
And it was also stressing the importance of filing early to avoid scams, which seems especially important, with all this talk about the IRS's future. Just protect yourself, get your refund quickly.
Yeah, they make a good point. Good digital security is so important.
Yeah.
Protecting your information, being wary of any emails that look suspicious, and just gathering all your tax documents as early as possible.
Yeah.
It's interesting because this advice is particularly relevant right now
Mm.
because there haven't really been any major changes to the tax code compared to last year.
Right. Oh, speaking of things that could impact your refund,
Mhm.
did you hear about the IRS sending out repayment checks worth up to $1,400?
Yeah, that's true. It seems like some people might have missed out on the recovery rebate credit from their 2021 tax returns, which was linked to those COVID stimulus payments. So this is the IRS's way of kind of making things right.
So if you were eligible for a stimulus payment back then, but you didn't get it or you got less than you should have, you might be getting some money back.
Yeah, basically. And the cool thing is these payments are automatic for those who qualify. So if you haven't filed your 2021 return, but you think you might be eligible, you still have until April 15th, 2025 to file and potentially receive a payment.
Wow. That's a pretty big incentive to file, even if you don't think you're getting a refund.
Yeah, it's worth looking into for sure. Now, a lot of people might have pretty straightforward tax situations, but of course it's not always the case. You sent in this video from CPA Logan Alec, and it goes into this thing called a CP 523 notice. I don't know. What are your thoughts about that?
It sounds kind of intimidating. I think it's about IRS installment agreements,
Hmm.
which, if I'm understanding this correctly, is when you work out a plan with the IRS to pay off your tax debt over time, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So the CP 523 notice is basically a warning that the IRS might terminate your installment agreement if you miss a payment or violate the terms. And it's serious stuff because if the IRS terminates your agreement, they could take more drastic measures.
Like levy bank accounts, garnish wages. That's scary stuff.
It is. It really highlights how important it is to stay on top of your tax obligations. And if you're having trouble, you really should seek out some expert advice. I mean, Alec gave an example of a client who defaulted on their agreement simply because they didn't pay the taxes they owed on their most recent return.
Wow.
It's an easy mistake to make, but it illustrates how important it is to understand the details of your agreement and to stay organized.
Yeah, it sounds like you really need professional guidance.
Definitely. Now, we've been talking about individual advice, but you send in some sources that also look at the future of the IRS itself, and that's where things get really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, we got some potentially controversial stuff in here.
Yeah.
A New York Post video and a Rumble video. They're highlighting statements from President Trump about potentially dismantling the IRS, firing newly hired agents, or even reassigning them to the border. It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it is. These statements have definitely sparked a lot of debate about what the future of the IRS might look like. And it's interesting to compare these statements to this document that you included, which outlines some of the potential consequences of actually dismantling the IRS. Things like a loss of government revenue, a possible surge in tax evasion, and even widespread confusion among taxpayers.
Yeah, it's pretty sobering. What are your thoughts on all this?
Well, regardless of your political stance, it's clear that any major changes to the IRS would have pretty widespread implications. And it also connects back to those installment agreements we were talking about. If the IRS is restructured, it could have a big impact on how those agreements are managed.
It's like a ripple effect, from individual situations to the structure of the entire agency. And speaking of different perspectives, We know you're interested in exploring a variety of viewpoints, so we wanted to touch on one of the more unique sources you sent in, a Rumble video from Julie Green Ministries.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting one.
Yeah, we want to be clear that we're not endorsing or refuting the content, but we did feel like it was important to present it as, one of the many diverse perspectives that you shared with us.
Mhm.
Julie Green talks about a dismantling of existing systems, a call for spiritual strength, and the belief that God is overthrowing enemies. What are your thoughts on how this perspective fits into our conversation today?
Well, it's definitely coming from a very different place, but there are echoes of what we've been discussing. That idea of dismantling systems resonates with these conversations about the IRS and how it might be restructured. And it's important to remember that tax issues can be really stressful for people. And so some people find comfort in these spiritual perspectives, especially during times of uncertainty.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You know, it's a lot to think about.
It is a lot to think about. Yeah, it really is a lot. It's so interesting how all of this stuff is connected,
Hmm.
like the practical tax tips and the
Hmm.
potential for you know, IRS reforms and even like the spiritual anxieties that people have about these changes. It seems like there's this feeling of uncertainty about the future kind of underlying everything.
Yeah, you're right. I think it's really interesting that you picked up on that. It's like people are kind of searching for a sense of security
Mm.
and guidance. And whether that comes from financial experts or spiritual leaders, it really speaks to our need to make sense of the world, especially when things feel kind of chaotic.
Definitely. So let's go back to those potential consequences of dismantling the IRS for a second. That document that you sent in painted a pretty bleak picture.
Yeah.
What do you think are the specific risks and benefits that we should be thinking about here?
Well, the document highlighted some pretty serious concerns, like a potential loss of government revenue, a surge in tax evasion, and just widespread confusion among taxpayers. If you remove this vital part of the system without a clear plan for what's going to replace it, it's easy to see how those problems could just snowball.
Yeah. It's like taking out a load-bearing wall without any support.
Yeah.
What about this idea of sending IRS agents to the border? That seems like a pretty major shift in focus.
Yeah, it definitely raises a lot of questions. On the one hand, some experts argue that the IRS's skills and resources, particularly their expertise in financial investigations, could be really valuable in combating crimes that happen at the border, like
Yeah.
drug trafficking and human smuggling.
I could see how that would be useful,
Yeah.
but wouldn't that be a huge departure from their traditional role?
Yeah.
And could it hurt their ability to actually enforce tax laws?
Yeah. Those are valid concerns. Shifting focus and resources in that direction would require a lot of careful thought about the potential impact on the IRS's core mission, which is tax collection. We also have to consider the legal and ethical implications.
What do you mean by that?
Well, for example, there's the potential for abuse of power. Could this lead to increased scrutiny of people and businesses that are just engaging in legitimate cross-border transactions? And there's also the question of whether the IRS is actually equipped to handle such complex and sensitive tasks. Border enforcement requires a very different set of skills and training than auditing.
Right. It's not just about crunching numbers. It's about, navigating potentially dangerous situations and understanding international law.
Exactly. So it's a really complex issue with no easy answers. I think this whole debate forces us to really think about the fundamental purpose of the IRS and whether its current structure is really serving the best interests of the country.
It's a conversation worth having. This is interesting. So I found this thing about, remember those statements about sending IRS agents to the border? Well, it turns out that started a whole other debate about the IRS and national security.
Oh, wow. This is getting really interesting.
Yeah. So imagine this. Instead of just focusing on, collecting taxes, the IRS could be restructured to play a more active role in border enforcement, using its investigative and enforcement powers to target illicit financial activities.
Wow. That's a pretty bold idea. But is that even feasible?
That's the million-dollar question. And there are some strong arguments on both sides. Some people believe that the IRS's expertise in financial investigations would be really valuable in combating things like drug trafficking, human smuggling, and other crimes that happen across borders.
Right. But wouldn't that require a massive overhaul of the entire agency?
Absolutely. It would require a huge shift in focus and resources. And as we talked about earlier, it raises those same legal and ethical questions.
Right, the potential for abuse of power, and whether the IRS even has the capabilities and training to do that kind of work.
And of course, there's the question of how a big change like that would impact the IRS's core mission, which is tax collection.
Right. It's a balancing act, weighing those potential benefits against the risks of disruption. But it's a debate we need to have. It challenges us to think about what role we want the IRS to play in our society.
Yeah. It's about making informed decisions that benefit everybody, not just a select few. It's amazing how one idea can spark such a wide-ranging discussion, and it all stemmed from those statements about sending IRS agents to the border.
It really shows you the power of ideas and the importance of having these thoughtful debates about complex issues. This has been a fascinating deep dive.
It really has. We've gone from the nuts and bolts of filing taxes to the potential for like restructuring the entire IRS. We even touched on like the spiritual anxieties that people have about all these changes. But I think we need to shift gears a little bit and explore something that might surprise you. What if instead of dwelling on what we might lose, we thought about what we could gain?
Okay, I'm listening.
So what if instead of focusing on dismantling or restructuring the IRS, we looked at how to make it a more proactive and supportive agency, one that like actually helps people, navigate the tax code rather than just enforcing it.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it. It's a complete shift from how we usually think about the IRS. Instead of seeing it as a burden or something to be afraid of, we're looking at it as like a partner in our financial well-being.
Exactly. What if the IRS could provide like more personalized assistance, maybe even financial counseling to help people plan for their future
Yeah.
and avoid those common tax pitfalls?
Yeah, I mean, that would require a pretty significant transformation of how the agency works and its whole approach.
Yeah.
But imagine if they could streamline that tax filing process, make it simpler, less intimidating. That would be a win for everyone.
I love that. Moving away from that adversarial dynamic
Mm.
and towards like a more collaborative relationship with the IRS, I think that could make a real difference.
Yeah, it could foster a sense of shared responsibility, with the government and the people working together to create a fairer and more efficient tax system. And it doesn't have to stop at taxes.
What do you mean?
Think about the role the IRS could play in promoting financial literacy
Mhm.
and entrepreneurship, especially in communities that are often underserved.
Wow, that's a really powerful idea. It could help level the playing field and create a more inclusive economy. It's a big vision, but it's pretty inspiring.
It really is. It all starts with changing the narrative, moving away from that fear and negativity, and embracing a more positive and hopeful perspective.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about today. I mean, we've explored so many different aspects of the IRS, from the practicalities of filing your taxes to these huge questions about its role and its potential for change.
It's been a really fascinating deep dive.
It has.
And we've covered a lot of ground, but I think the biggest takeaway for me is that the IRS and our relationship with it is so much more complex than we often realize.
I agree. And no matter what happens in the future, staying informed and proactive about our taxes is really important.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, and it's the best way to protect yourself and your financial future. We've talked about a lot of potential scenarios, both positive and negative, but ultimately the future of the IRS and how it affects our lives is something we all have a stake in.
So what can we do?
Engage in these conversations, challenge assumptions, and explore different perspectives. And don't be afraid to imagine a better future, one where the IRS is a force for good in our society.
That's a great way to put it. Well, that's it for this week's deep dive into the world of the IRS. We hope you found it enlightening and maybe even a little bit inspiring.
We encourage you to keep exploring these ideas and having thoughtful conversations about the things that matter most to you.
Until next time, stay curious and remember, even taxes can be an opportunity for growth and positive change. Thanks for joining us.